On March 11, 2024, at 14:47 and 22 seconds Coordinated Universal Time, astronaut Wade Carver was conducting a routine extravehicular activity along the southern rim of Shackleton Crater, 89.9 degrees south latitude, 0.0 degrees east longitude, one of the most permanently shadowed regions on the Moon's surface. Wade was 41 years old, former Air Force test pilot with 3,200 flight hours, veteran of one previous lunar mission with Artemis 4, and considered by NASA's Astronaut Office to be one of the most technically precise operators in the program. This was his second time walking on the Moon. It would be the last time he would see the lunar surface the way humanity had always understood it. The mission parameters were straightforward. Wade was deploying ground-penetrating radar equipment from the pressurized rover, mapping subsurface ice deposits for future water extraction operations. The work was methodical, almost routine, the kind of task that required attention but not innovation. His headset crackled with the calm voice of Mission Control in Houston, Flight Controller Deacon Mills confirming telemetry data every 6 minutes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The sun hung just above the crater's rim, casting long shadows across terrain that hadn't seen direct light in over 2 billion years. Wade's suit read external temperature at minus 173 degrees Celsius, standard for this region, cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide into dry ice on contact. Then the rover's ground-penetrating radar returned something that made no sense. Wade stopped, checked the display twice, ran a diagnostic on the equipment. The diagnostic came back clean. The reading remained impossible. At a depth of 47 meters below the surface, the radar had detected a subsurface cavity with geometrically perfect walls, dimensions measuring 40 meters in diameter. And most troubling of all, a thermal signature reading minus 170 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding regolith. On the Moon, where geological activity ceased 3 billion years ago, where there are no tectonic plates, no volcanic vents, no internal heat source of any kind, a 3-degree temperature differential at that depth was physically impossible. It suggested an active heat source. There was no active heat source on the Moon. Wade reported the anomaly to Houston. His voice stayed level, technical, describing the readings exactly as they appeared. Deacon's response came back after the standard 1.3-second light delay, asking for triple confirmation on all instruments. Wade complied, running every verification protocol in the manual. Each test confirmed the same result. The cavity was there. The heat signature was real. Then something happened that Wade had never experienced in 7 years as an astronaut. 4 minutes of absolute silence from Mission Control. Not technical difficulty. Not signal degradation. Complete communication blackout on a channel that had been functioning perfectly seconds before. 4 minutes is an eternity when you're standing alone on the surface of another world, 239,000 miles from home, with your oxygen supply measured in hours, and your only lifeline to Earth suddenly, inexplicably, silent. When Deacon's voice finally returned, it was different. Controlled, yes, but with an edge Wade recognized from his military days. The tone of someone receiving orders from higher authority while trying to maintain operational calm. Wade, Houston, we need visual confirmation of the anomaly. Proceed to the radar coordinates and investigate surface access points. Maintain radio discipline on Zulu channel for all subsequent transmissions. Wade felt his heartbeat spike, not from fear, but from recognition. Zulu channel was a military-grade encrypted frequency reserved for classified Space Force operations, never used in civilian NASA missions. He'd been briefed on its existence during security clearance, but had never been told when or why it might be activated. Now, it was active. For a geological survey mission. Wade drove the rover 300 meters south to the coordinates. The terrain here was unremarkable, just more regolith and scattered rocks, shadows stretching toward the crater's interior darkness. Then he saw it. A fissure, maybe 2 meters wide, cutting vertically into the surface with edges too straight to be natural fracture. Wade aimed his helmet lights down into the opening, and his breath caught. Not because of what he saw, but because of what the light revealed. These weren't random cracks in ancient lunar bedrock. They were steps. Perfectly angular, descending into darkness with geometric precision that no natural geological process could create. Each step measured exactly 30 centimeters in height, each tread exactly 60 centimeters deep, angles holding at 90 degrees with the kind of mathematical perfection that only comes from deliberate construction. Wade stood at the edge, looking down into manufactured darkness, and for the first time in his career, he understood why Houston had gone silent. Wade activated his suit's full-spectrum recording system, standard protocol for any unplanned discovery, and began the descent. The first step held his weight without issue, the surface solid and stable despite being 47 meters below what should have been shallow regolith. His suit's altimeter tracked the descent with precision that became increasingly disturbing. 50 meters depth, 60 meters, 80 meters. The steps continued downward in that same perfect geometric pattern, each one identical to the last, and Wade's mind kept circling back to a single uncomfortable fact that his training couldn't reconcile. The average depth of lunar regolith, the layer of pulverized rock and dust that covers the moon's bedrock, was 4 to 5 meters in most regions, possibly reaching 10 meters in ancient mare basins. At 80 meters depth, he should have been descending through solid basalt bedrock, ancient lava flows that had cooled over 3 billion years ago. But the walls around him weren't basalt. They were something else entirely. Smooth and dark, with a surface texture his gloved hand couldn't quite identify, almost manufactured in its consistency. At 90 meters depth, Wade noticed the first symbols. They were carved into the wall at eye level, a sequence of marks that initially seemed random until he studied them for more than a few seconds. 1 mark, then 1 mark again, then 2 marks, then 3 marks, then 5 marks, then 8 marks, then 13 marks. The pattern continued downward with each subsequent step, and Wade felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the suit's temperature regulation. This was the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern that appears throughout nature in spiral galaxies, nautilus shells, flower petals, and now apparently carved into walls deep beneath the lunar surface by something that understood mathematics the way humans understood mathematics. He reported this to Houston on the Zulu channel. The response from Elliot Chen, the mission's systems engineer, came back with carefully controlled surprise. "Wade, we're receiving your telemetry, but the data doesn't correlate with known geological structures. Your altimeter shows 120 meters depth. That's impossible for this region. The regolito layer simply doesn't extend that deep." Wade continued descending because stopping would mean acknowledging that he was inside something that couldn't exist, and his training had prepared him for equipment malfunction, for medical emergencies, for rapid decompression, but not for encountering architecture. At 150 meters, his heads-up display showed remaining oxygen at 4.2 hours, which should have triggered a mandatory abort and return to the surface, but Houston hadn't issued that order. Instead, Deacon's voice came through with instructions that violated every safety protocol Wade had memorized. Continue descent. Document everything. We need visual confirmation of the source. The fact that Mission Control was willing to push him past safe return margins told Wade everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking this discovery. They would rather risk an astronaut than leave this uninvestigated. At 190 meters depth, Wade's suit radar lost contact with the surface entirely, which should have been technically impossible given the system's rated penetration range of 100 meters through solid rock. Yet somehow the signal couldn't reach back up through whatever material surrounded him now. Marin Holt, the mission's orbital module pilot circling 60 miles above in the lunar command module, confirmed what Wade already suspected. "Wade, I've lost your beacon. Orbital radar shows nothing at your last known coordinates. You're below our scanning threshold." Wade understood the implication. If something went wrong now, if his oxygen failed, or his suit tore, or he simply got lost in this impossible descent, nobody would be able to find him. He would become the first human to die inside the moon, and nobody would know where to look. Then he saw the light. It wasn't reflected sunlight, wasn't the beam from his helmet lamp bouncing back from ice crystals or metallic ore. This was light coming from below, a faint blue glow that pulsed with slow, rhythmic consistency, like bioluminescence in deep ocean waters, except there was no biology on the moon, no life, no possible explanation for light at this depth. Deacon's voice cut through immediately, no longer controlled, now carrying unmistakable tension. "Wade! Negative! Abort descent now! Return to surface immediately." But Wade was already making a decision that would define the rest of his life and possibly change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. He reached down to his suit's emergency systems panel and disabled the locator beacon, the one device that would let Houston track his exact position. The telemetry feed went dark except for basic vitals. Deacon's voice erupted through the headset, demanding reactivation, but Wade was already moving down the final steps toward the blue light, and what he saw when he reached the bottom stole every rational thought from his mind. This wasn't a cave. This wasn't a lava tube. This was a structure. The chamber was perfectly spherical, 40 meters in diameter, and that perfection was the first thing that violated everything Wade understood about natural formation. Spheres don't occur in geology. You find crystals with geometric faces, hexagonal basalt columns, even dome-shaped lava bubbles, but never perfect spheres carved into bedrock. The walls were smooth, almost mirror-like, composed of a material that Wade's handheld spectrometer refused to identify. The device simply returning an error message that read, "Material composition unknown. No database match available." He took 3 separate readings from different points on the wall. Each time, the same result: unknown. The blue light that had drawn him down here emanated from the center of the chamber, and when Wade stepped fully into the space, his boots found purchase on what his mind insisted on calling a floor, even though the chamber was spherical and should have had no floor, no up or down, just curved wall extending in all directions. Yet gravity pulled him toward one side of the sphere as if that side had been designated as ground, and when he checked his suit's gravimeter, the reading made his breath stop entirely. 9.81 meters per second squared. Earth gravity. Not the moon's 1.62 meters per second squared that he'd been walking in for the past 6 hours, but the full gravitational pull of Earth. Impossible at this depth. Impossible anywhere on the moon, which has 1/6 Earth's mass, and should never, under any physics he understood, produce this level of gravitational acceleration. Wade stood there in a spherical room nearly 200 meters below the lunar surface, experiencing Earth-normal gravity in a place where that force simply could not exist, and he understood with absolute clarity that he was inside technology so far beyond human capability that trying to understand its principles with his training would be like explaining quantum mechanics to someone from the Bronze Age. This wasn't just advanced, this was something else entirely. At the chamber's center, suspended exactly 1 meter above the floor that shouldn't exist, floated a cylinder 2 meters in height and perhaps 60 centimeters in diameter, rotating slowly on its vertical axis with no visible means of support, no magnetic fields his instruments could detect, no propulsion system, just smooth rotation in defiance of everything Newton had ever written about objects in motion. Wade approached carefully, his training screaming at him to maintain safe distance from unknown objects, but his hand was already reaching out before conscious thought could stop it. The cylinder's surface was warm to the touch, exactly 37 degrees Celsius, human body temperature, and that detail felt intentional somehow, as if whoever built this wanted the first human to touch it, to recognize something familiar in all this impossible strangeness. The surface wasn't smooth, but covered in what appeared to be images, maps perhaps, showing star fields that Wade's 4 years of astronaut training and 2 degrees in aerospace engineering told him were not visible from Earth or from the Moon, or from anywhere in the solar system. These were constellations he had never seen, stellar formations that existed somewhere else in the galaxy, rendered with such precision that individual stars appeared as distinct points of light embedded somehow in the cylinder's surface. Wade activated his suit camera and began photographing everything. High-resolution images capturing the maps, the symbols, the impossible gravity readings from his instruments, and he transmitted it all in a compressed data burst back to Houston. 47 seconds of transmission containing everything he had documented. The response came exactly 47 seconds later, and it wasn't from Deacon or Elliot or anyone he'd been speaking with all mission. The entire communication system went dark. Not degraded signal, not interference. Complete communication blackout initiated from the ground, and when Wade checked his suit's diagnostic panel, he saw the shutdown command had come with a priority override code he'd only seen in classified briefings, the kind of authorization that required Space Force command approval. Someone with military authority higher than NASA's civilian mission control had just severed his contact with Earth, and they had done it the moment his photos reached Houston. Wade was still processing this when he heard something in the static of his dead radio, a fragment of conversation that shouldn't have been on his frequency. Voices that didn't realize he could still receive, even though he couldn't transmit. The voice belonged to Tyson Reed, the flight director at Johnson Space Center, speaking to someone Wade didn't recognize. Reed confirms the star maps correspond to the Zeta Reticuli region. This isn't terrestrial. Repeat, this is not of terrestrial origin. Then another voice, clinical and measured. Recommend immediate communication blackout and full quarantine protocols upon return. This stays classified under National Security Space Activities designation. Wade knew that designation. It was the same classification level used for reconnaissance satellites with nuclear capabilities, for orbital weapons platforms that officially didn't exist, for things the government would never acknowledge publicly, even under congressional subpoena. He turned back to examine the chamber walls more carefully, and that's when he saw them. Words forming on the smooth surface, as if being written in real time by an invisible hand. Letters appearing in English, in his language, in the language of the species that had only reached this moon 55 years ago and had never, according to every official record, gone this deep. The words said, We've been waiting. Wade's heart hammered against his ribs as more words appeared beneath the first message, forming with the slow deliberation of someone choosing their words carefully. You are not the first humans here. You are simply the first we allowed to find this. 2. Wade photographed the message with hands that had started to shake, not from fear, but from the cognitive dissonance of watching words appear on a wall nearly 200 meters beneath the moon's surface, written in English by something that understood not just his language but the precise moment he would be reading them. The text wasn't engraved or projected or painted. It was forming, the letters materializing as if the wall itself was becoming transparent in specific patterns to reveal light behind it. And as Wade watched, more words appeared below the first two sentences. Apollo 10 found this chamber in May of 1969. They were told never to return. They obeyed. Wade knew the Apollo program's history as well as he knew his own flight logs. Apollo 10 had been the dress rehearsal for the moon landing, the mission that did everything Apollo 11 would do except actually touch down on the surface. Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan had piloted the lunar module to within 15 kilometers of the Sea of Tranquility, closer than any humans had been to another world, and then they'd return to orbit and come home. The official record stated they completed all objectives perfectly. But Wade also knew something that most space enthusiasts didn't, a detail buried in mission transcripts that only became interesting in retrospect. Apollo 10 had lost contact with mission control for 47 minutes while passing behind the moon, completely normal radio blackout caused by the moon's mass-blocking Earth signals, except 47 minutes was significantly longer than the predicted 30-minute maximum for their orbital path. 47 minutes. Wade looked at the symbols he'd photographed earlier, the depth reading where he'd first detected the anomaly, the seconds of transmission before Houston cut his communications, and the pattern assembled itself with the kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the hidden image in static. 47 meters initial depth of the anomaly. 47 seconds of photo transmission before the blackout. 47 minutes of Apollo 10's extended silence. This number wasn't random. It was a marker, a signature, something that connected events across 55 years of space exploration with mathematical precision that couldn't be coincidence. More text appeared on the wall. This structure was built 380,000 years ago, when your species first emerged on Earth. This is not coincidence. This is an observation post. 380,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans appeared in Africa, the first members of Homo sapiens with brain structures and physical capabilities identical to every human alive today. Wade had learned this in undergraduate anthropology, a footnote in his aerospace engineering degree, but now that number took on weight that made his suit feel too tight. If this structure had been built at the exact moment humanity emerged as a species, then whoever built it had been watching from the beginning, observing, waiting, documenting the rise of technological civilization from tribes with stone tools to nations with spacecraft. The implications cascaded through Wade's mind faster than he could process them. We weren't alone. We had never been alone. And something had been patient enough to watch us for 380,000 years. Wade tried his emergency backup communication system, a redundant channel that should have worked even with the primary systems disabled. And to his surprise, a voice answered, but it wasn't Houston. It was Marin, speaking from the command module in lunar orbit, her voice tight with stress. Wade, I intercepted your transmission. Tyson ordered me to maintain radio silence with you, but I can't. I won't. You need to know what's happening down there. Wade started to respond, but Marin kept talking, words rushing out like she'd been holding them back for too long. They know about this structure. NASA has known since 1969. Apollo 11 didn't land randomly in the Sea of Tranquility. They deliberately chose the safest site farthest from the polar regions because they knew something was here, and they weren't ready to deal with it. Every mission since then, every orbital survey, every landing site selection, they've all carefully avoided the South Pole until now. Wade felt the words land with physical weight. Why now? Why send Artemis 6 here if they knew what we'd find? Marin's answer came with the bitter clarity of someone who just had her entire career recontextualized. Because you weren't sent here by accident, Wade. This mission was planned specifically to make this discovery official. They needed someone to find it, to document it, to create a public record they could use to justify what comes next. You were selected because your psychological profile said you'd follow through, because your technical background meant your documentation would be credible, because they needed an astronaut who would go into that structure instead of returning to the surface when things got strange. The implication settled over Wade like lunar dust. He wasn't an explorer making first contact. He was a prop in a disclosure operation that had been planned for decades. "What comes next?" Wade asked, and Marin's response carried the weight of classified briefings she shouldn't have accessed. First official contact. Not first contact, Wade. They're calling it re-establishment of dialogue. Those words, "we've been waiting," they're not a greeting. They're a reminder. Wade made the ascent back to the surface in silence. The steps that had taken him 40 minutes to descend now passing beneath his boots in what felt like half that time, though his suit chronometer showed 11 hours had elapsed since he'd first entered the fissure. 11 hours. His oxygen supply had been rated for 6.5 hours maximum, with reserve protocols triggering mandatory abort at 4 hours remaining. He should have suffocated 7 hours ago, collapsed somewhere in that impossible descent, another casualty of human ambition reaching too far beyond its capabilities. But when Wade checked his heads-up display, the oxygen gauge read 87% capacity remaining. Not empty, not even depleted. 87%. As if the suit had been manufacturing breathable air from nothing, or as if time inside that structure operated under different rules than time measured by atomic clocks on Earth, or as if whoever built that chamber had decided that the first human to find it should survive the encounter, regardless of the limitations of his technology. Wade didn't understand which explanation disturbed him more. When he emerged from the fissure into the perpetual twilight of Shackleton Crater's rim, 3 autonomous rovers were already positioned in a perimeter around the site, each one bearing the blue and silver insignia of the United States Space Force, not NASA's red chevron. They hadn't been there when he descended. Someone had deployed them while he was underground, which meant someone had known exactly where he would emerge, and exactly when, despite his disabled locator beacon, despite the communication blackout, despite being nearly 200 meters below radar range. The rover's cameras tracked his movement with mechanical precision, as a voice he didn't recognize came through his headset on a frequency that hadn't been active before. Astronaut Carver, proceed directly to the lunar module. Quarantine protocols are in effect. No exterior sample collection, no equipment retrieval, direct ingress only. Wade complied because arguing with Space Force deployment orders while standing on the moon with 87% oxygen that shouldn't exist felt like a poor tactical choice. The return to Earth took 3 days of absolute silence, Wade confined to an isolation pod inside the command module while Marin piloted them home, and the silence wasn't medical quarantine for lunar pathogens that both of them knew didn't exist. This was informational quarantine, The kind of isolation that prevents contamination of official narratives before they can be properly constructed. When the capsule splashed down in the Pacific, Wade was transferred directly to a windowless medical facility at Johnson Space Center, where he spent 6 days being debriefed by people who never gave their names and who asked the same questions in different configurations, as if trying to find inconsistencies in his account. On the 7th day, they presented him with a document classified under National Security Space Activities Protocols, 47 pages of legal text that ultimately said one thing with perfect clarity. Wade Carver would never speak publicly about what he found in that chamber, about the message on the walls, about the star maps or the gravity or the impossible oxygen, and, if he violated this agreement, he would be prosecuted under espionage statutes that carried minimum sentences of 20 years in federal prison. 2 weeks after Wade signed the non-disclosure agreement, NASA held a press conference that was broadcast to 1.4 billion people across every major news network on Earth. The administrator stood at a podium bearing the agency's seal and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed every word with lawyers present. Mission Artemis 6 has confirmed the discovery of a structure of non-terrestrial origin located in the south polar region of the Moon. The structure's age, composition, and purpose remain under investigation. We anticipate releasing preliminary findings within 30 days and will continue to provide updates as analysis progresses. The statement lasted 90 seconds. It revealed nothing about the message, nothing about Apollo 10, nothing about 380,000 years of observation, nothing about the fact that whoever built this had been waiting for humanity to develop spaceflight capability, and it especially said nothing about why the structure contained gravity and warmth and words written in English. The official narrative was simple. We found something alien. We don't know what it is. We're studying it. Clean. Contained. Controllable. But Wade had made a decision during those 11 hours underground, a decision that would end his career and possibly his freedom, but felt like the only honest choice available to him. Before they'd taken his suit for analysis, before the quarantine, before the lawyers and the NDAs and the careful political theater, he had copied a single audio file to a data chip no bigger than his thumbnail and passed it to Marin during the 72-hour return flight, encrypted with a code they'd established during training exercises 2 years earlier, when neither of them imagined they'd need secure communication hidden from their own agency. Marin had given that chip to a journalist named Sarah Chen at The Guardian, and Sarah had verified its authenticity through 3 independent audio forensics laboratories before publishing it exactly 36 hours after NASA's official announcement. The audio was Wade's voice, recorded in that spherical chamber, reading the message that had appeared on the wall. "We've been waiting. You are not the first humans here. Apollo 10 found this chamber in May of 1969. To the revelation that the message had been written in English, that it referenced specific human missions, that it demonstrated knowledge of our history, ignited debates that made the original discovery seem almost mundane by comparison. The question that consumed every discussion, every panel, every emergency session of Congress and the United Nations Security Council was the same question that had frozen Wade's thoughts when he first saw those words forming on the wall. If they've been waiting since we emerged as a species 380,000 years ago, what exactly have they been waiting for? The structure was described by NASA as an artifact, something left behind, but Wade knew better because he'd stood in that chamber and felt its warmth and watched words appear in real time. This wasn't abandoned technology. This was an active installation, and whatever operated it had been patient enough to watch human civilization rise from stone tools to spacecraft across timescales that made recorded history look like a brief flicker. We weren't discoverers exploring an empty cosmos. We were specimens finally developed enough to be shown the laboratory we'd always lived in. And that realization carried implications that philosophers and theologians and scientists would spend decades trying to process. NASA announced Artemis 7 for late 2025, officially described as an extended research mission to study the structure. But Wade had seen the mission manifest during his debriefing, seen the crew composition that included a linguist, a cultural anthropologist, and 2 specialists in first contact protocols, positions that had never existed in any previous space mission. They weren't planning to study a ruin. They were preparing for conversation. The leaked audio that ended Wade's career and began humanity's reckoning with its place in the cosmos concluded with 47 seconds of his unfiltered thoughts, recorded in that impossible gravity while standing before maps of stars we'd never seen. They're not coming because they never left. The Moon isn't a natural satellite captured by Earth's gravity 4.5 billion years ago. It's a station. An observation post positioned perfectly to watch a planet where something interesting was about to happen. And we've always known, haven't we? Some part of our consciousness has always known. It's why we look up. It's why we've told stories about the Moon since language began. It's why we built rockets to reach it, even when every rational calculation said the cost wasn't worth the scientific return. We weren't exploring. We were returning. We were going home to something that's been waiting 380,000 years to see if we'd make it. The question nobody at NASA will answer. The question that should terrify us more than anything else in human history. Waiting for what? Artemis 7 is scheduled to launch in 8 months. The crew has been selected. The mission profile includes provisions for extended surface operations and something new in the equipment manifest: translation hardware, communication protocols for first contact, and a small wooden box containing images, music, mathematical proofs, and a message in 173 languages that begins with the same 2 words in each one. We're ready. Chew. Whether that's true, whether humanity is prepared for answers to questions we didn't know we should be asking, remains the largest unknown in our species' history. But ready or not, the conversation is about to begin. And something that has watched us for 380,000 years is finally going to explain why.